Hi, it's Professor Corbett again. Welcome to the first week of Fire Science 101 599, our quick summer session. What I'd like to talk to you about today is the content of the first three chapters of our book. And of course, our book is this one here, Introduction to Fire Protection Emergency Services. This is the book that is in the syllabus and the one that you're using to read for our course. And it's the material where, of course, the quiz questions will come from. So it's important that you read the text first, as I mentioned in the earlier video, before you take the quiz. And not a bad idea to also do that for the discussion board to get a sense of where we're headed with things. So let's get into it. So the first chapter actually deals with issues of fire service education and the firefighter selection process. So let's talk a little bit about those things. The book talks about college programs in fire science, and of course, again, having looked at the roster of this class, I don't think there's any fire majors in this course, but you're probably aware that John Jay College has undergraduate and graduate fire-related programs. So, for example, we actually offer two baccalaureate degrees at John Jay in fire-related programs. The first one is our Bachelor of Science in Fire Science itself, which is more of a technical degree. It looks at issues of fire protection systems, building construction, fire behavior, sort of the nuts and bolts and technical nuts and bolts of fire protection and firefighting. So that's our one major. We have our other major, which has recently been revised to a great extent. It's our other Bachelor of Science degree in Emergency Services Administration. And what we've done basically is put together fire, emergency management, and emergency medical services under a Bachelor of Science degree, specifically revolving around the issues of management of those services. So, for example, fire department management, emergency medical services management, and emergency management, which is sort of more broad brush specialization that looks at general disasters, including fires, but a lot of other things that we'll talk about toward the end of the semester. So those two programs we offer, again, are both four-year programs. We're unique in the sense that there aren't a lot of four-year programs across this country. Most of them, in fact, are associate's degrees, which the book tends to talk about. One thing I have to tell you also about the book is this was written by a firefighter from California, so it's very much of a California spin to the text. Some of the things that he talks about aren't applicable, for example, in New York City Fire Department or perhaps the police department, but generally speaking, it gives a good overview of the field of fire protection and firefighting. So when we talk about college programs, we're unique that we do have the two four-year programs. We also have a brand new emergency management master's program as well that some of you might be interested going forward. So a lot of colleges, community colleges across the country, are the ones that offer associate's degrees. And those programs are intended for firefighters or EMTs or emergency managers who are already working in a lot of cases and would like to advance their careers, particularly through promotion, things like that. So as you go forward in your own career, you'll find out that your college degree will play an important role in helping you get promoted. It's not always the requirement for the college degree to get promoted, but it's certainly, no question about it, will help you along the way. So the text talks about again, these different types of academic programs out there, as contrasted to what the fire department does, since we're talking fire science now and fire department operations. The fire department has its own training academy, and those training efforts, which we'll talk about later in the semester as well in more detail, tend to deal with issues of different types of skills and manipulative skills, and specifically as well. So, of course, that's how you learn how to be a firefighter. So college programs tend to make you a better firefighter once you have become one, or as you become one. The Fire Academy, on the other hand, provides the basic skills and techniques and things that you need to actually be a firefighter or an officer in the fire department. So they complement each other, the college and the training programs. In terms of hiring and things, we all know that, for example, in New York City, civil service is the methodology we use to hire firefighters. We give them tests, same for police departments, police officers, things like that. It's a pretty standardized way of approaching things, and it tries to sort of determine the best potential candidates to become a firefighter or a police officer if that's the situation. And they try to use what are called objective tests that don't have any bias in them, do not require any kind of interpretation. Whether it's pretty clear cut, either someone can do something or someone cannot do something. So when we talk about firefighter entry exams, we, for example, talk about the CPAT, which you'll learn about, which is now pretty much standardized across the country. Ironically, actually sort of started here in New York City. The FDNY, after several lawsuits involving minorities, particularly women, were required to change their entry exam to make the entry exam more job related. And the CPAT is sort of a descendant of that situation that evolved from the early 1980s. So we still sort of look back that far as our tests go to get into the fire department. The chapter also deals with human relations and, I should say, human resources and HR departments and things like that, promotions and what have you in the fire department. Once you've been involved as a firefighter, for example, in the fire department, you probably would like to get promoted to position of lieutenant or captain or higher, battalion chief, deputy chief, assistant chief. These are each steps along the way to more and more management responsibilities. So lieutenant is responsible for a fire company, as well as a captain. The battalion chiefs are responsible for several fire companies, so that might mean a few dozen people. And the chiefs, the deputy chiefs, assistant chiefs, all the way up the line, end up managing much larger and larger segments of the fire department. So each one of those is, for most cases, a promotional examination that you would have to take. So the text talks about the career path if you're a firefighter, going further up the chain of command, literally, all the way up to perhaps the chief of department, which is the senior officer of the fire department. The selection process, again, we talked a little bit about that with the CPAT test. Most firefighter examinations involve written tests as well, and they vary by jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But know that, again, civil service, and which are usually organized either the state or in some cases like New York at the city level, they're the ones who set the criteria for the test. Again, trying to be as objective as possible to try to find the best people possible for those positions. Because as you can imagine, the fire departments across America, have a very long line of people wanting to get into the fire department. So particularly at FDNY, tens of thousands of people apply to get a relatively small number, a few thousand jobs that are actually available. So it's a very competitive situation. And if you are so inclined to want to become a firefighter, or for that matter, a police officer or some other uniformed services, it's not a bad idea to thoroughly understand exactly how the test is organized, when they're offered, and things like that, what the requirements are, what the age limits are, things like that. So that's pretty much chapter 1 in a nutshell. Chapter 2 deals with fire protection career opportunities. And this is a good point to talk about. We've discussed firefighting and firefighters. Maybe there's some folks out there that might be interested in fire protection that might involve things other than firefighting. Now, what could those things be? Well, so for example, some of our students have gone on to be corporate fire safety directors. In New York City, we have a requirement that, for example, high-rise office buildings have a full-time fire safety director. In some cases, a lot of these businesses actually have more than one person. And those people are responsible for a variety of things, even beyond just high-rise drills and high-rise related fire safety issues. They get involved in emergency management issues. They get involved in doing drills for all sorts of other kind of potential disasters. They're very important positions. And so those positions don't require you to pick up a hose or put a ladder up or anything like that. These are more suit and tie type positions in which you become a corporate again, fire safety person. Another possibility, we've had students work for the insurance industry. So insurance industry, of course, is very interested in fires because you people get fire insurance, right? So very often we will have students who end up working for insurance companies through the adjuster area where they actually look at losses that occur due to a fire and figure out how much dollar value was involved. We have insurance inspectors, folks who go out and look at buildings before they're insured to make sure that, excuse me, they're viable for insurance, because no insurance company wants to insure something that's literally on the verge of burning to the ground. So they look and inspect places before they do this. We have students go there. We've had students work in fire protection system contractor type positions. So working in sprinkler design and fire alarm design, things like that. Working, on drafting tables or working on the computer to lay out new systems for buildings. We've had some students go there. We've also had students work for code consulting firms, firms where former students go out and look at particularly new projects, new buildings, work with architects to look at the fire safety requirements that may be applicable based upon the local building and fire codes for those buildings. So we've had those type of people out there. And they're probably one of the largest segments of our students who didn't end up wanting to be a firefighter but wanted to be involved with the fire department is we have a number of our students have gone on to become full-time fire inspectors working for the fire department and their fire prevention division. So those folks basically go out every day of the week, 9 to 5, and they visit various commercial buildings particularly, but also multiple dwellings, apartment buildings, things like that. But go out and inspect them for compliance with the city's fire code. So we have a bunch of people doing that as well. So when we talk about careers in fire protection, it's not just become a firefighter, right? That there are in fact other kinds of positions that are out there as well. And again, we've had students who have gone on to do those kind of things. So the textbook, of course, as I'm just looking at it here, does talk about both the firefighting, the uniformed services, the civilian positions in the fire department. Like I said, fire inspectors. We also have had folks that go on to do public education in the Fire Prevention Bureau of the fire department. There's another civilian type position in which they give lectures to young children in school groups and elderly folks at nursing homes or old age facilities and things like that. And the reason I mention those two is that because when it comes to fire fatalities, unfortunately, in this country, the youngest and the oldest are disproportionately represented in the number of fatalities we have. So those are areas where we've got to spend a lot of time explaining to people, either the young children or the very senior adults, how to deal with fire and how to think about it and to keep themselves safe, basically. And so fire prevention efforts are really important in that realm. And then again, the chapter wraps up with private sector jobs, which is, as I mentioned earlier, was the jobs like the sprinkler industry, the firearm industry, the insurance industry. Those are all jobs in the private sector. So those are always a possibility for positions for folks that get a degree from John Jay College or an associate degree from another community college, perhaps. So that's always a possibility as well. All right, so chapter 3 is a little bit of a history chapter. So this is a chapter that sort of takes you from the beginning of firefighting with the Romans and takes you sort of up to today in terms of how we deal with fire. At the end of the day, though, if you think about it, fire still requires someone to put water on it to put it out. So it's still the same as it was 3,000 years ago. So when we talk about the oldest firefighters and the ones of current age, they're still doing essentially the same job. Now, is the job much more complicated today? Yes, it is. We have organized fire departments, certainly, that do all sorts of different things beyond fires, to tell you the truth. But the basic function of putting water on a fire and stopping the destruction of the fire from involving, for example, surrounding buildings and things, that hasn't changed for literally hundreds or really thousands of years. So the text walks you through there. Some important notes along the way. The Romans, of course, they were a military-based operation. They're the ones who we think about for the most part as the earliest firefighters, organized firefighting. But that said, perhaps the most important fire, even in American history, didn't occur in the United States. Actually, it was in London in 1666. That fire wiped out a majority of the city of London. Ironically, came a year after a plague that wiped out all the people, so the fire wiped out a lot of their buildings. It was a terrible time in London. But what it did is it changed the direction internationally in the way fires are handled. They needed to have sort of an organized, dedicated firefighting force. And so that's what we ended up with after the London fire. And we here in the United States copied a lot of things that were done over there. So the very first fire engine, for example, that was created, for the most part, was developed in England, in London. And ironically, New York City bought two of those type of early engines, one of which, if you're ever up in the Catskills near the city of Hudson, New York, that's way up the Hudson by the Rip Van Winkle Bridge, there's a fire museum up there for the New York State Association of Firefighters, and it's an incredible place to visit if you're on vacation up that way or happen to be in the neighborhood. They literally have hundreds of pieces of apparatus, but most importantly, they literally have one of the two original engines that New York City bought in 1731 on display up there. It's an incredible possession that they have. You should go see it. When you look at it, you think, oh my God, how could this thing ever put any fires out? It's tiny. It's the size of a dining room, less than the size of your dining room table. So it's incredibly small, but that's where our very first fire engine started here in the United States, was that one and a handful of others in Boston and Charleston, some other Philadelphia and some other places that have evolved into these monstrosities now on 4 wheels or 8 wheels that drive around the city. They see all the time blaring their sirens and lights and things. So that very first fire engine, you can see it up there in Hudson. So we've evolved. And so the chapter talks about how in our earliest cities we had volunteer fire departments. It's hard to believe that New York City had a volunteer fire department, which it did. As a matter of fact, to tell you the truth, Brooklyn had its own volunteer fire department, and different small fire departments were in the Bronx and in Queens and Staten Island until 1898, when the city of New York was actually created. Right up until 1898, the 5 boroughs, we call them today, were all separate entities. They were separate from each other, and it was in 1898 they all were brought together under this umbrella called the City of New York, and it's that really is when the FDNY really started to be organized and things, and around all 5 boroughs. So we talk about these cities. Think that 200 years ago that they were staffed by volunteers. As a matter of fact, at the time of the Civil War in New York City, they still had a volunteer fire department of almost 8,000 firefighters. Can you imagine that? A volunteer organization of 8,000 firemen. So it was quite the organization. These folks, of course, when you say the word volunteer, I mean they're not getting paid. They all had other kind of jobs to do. And what the text points out is that even though the larger cities eventually evolved into career or professional fire departments, a lot of small towns and medium-sized towns across America to this day still are volunteer fire departments. As a matter of fact, the majority of the United States, in terms of geographical area, is covered by volunteer fire departments. These are folks that get little or no money for what they do, risk their lives, and in some cases die, unfortunately, and things. But they do it because they have a sense of civic responsibility. So they want to be part of the fire department. So, for example, in Long Island and Westchester County, upstate New York, northern New Jersey, even southern New Jersey, these are all areas that have lots of dozens and dozens, hundreds and hundreds of volunteer fire departments all over the place. So some of you who might move out of New York City, or if you're not living in New York right now, you might ask around and say, do we have a volunteer fire department protecting me where I live? And if you move to an area like that, maybe you might want to be a volunteer firefighter after you've taken this course. Maybe I've interested you enough to do that. So again, historically, the cities eventually went to career departments. The textbook talks about the equipment, the hand engines, that very first one, 1731 I mentioned, which evolved into steam fire engines that used wood or coal to operate a boiler. The boiler then ran a pump, and the pump pumped the water. The book points out that a steam fire engine doesn't need very many people to operate it. So the numbers of firefighters need to operate a hand pump engine is much more than needed for a steam engine. And then with the steam engine, of course, was followed by ultimately by motorized apparatus like we have today, which requires even just really one person to operate it. So technology has evolved in the fire service to require fewer and fewer firefighters. That involve their hoses as well. For example, all the early hoses made of leather. Can you imagine that? Leather fire hose connected with copper rivets. Of course, you can imagine it. They had to make sure it didn't dry out, and it was always full of leaks and things. We didn't get our first hydrants until the early 19th century in New York City. One down Liberty Street, actually, near the World Trade Center, where the first hydrant in New York was put in. Of course, those use wooden water mains with small water tanks attached to them. So the water supply wasn't very good. New York City, we had several conflagrations, which are massive fires. One in 1835, New York City's biggest fire in its history, separate from 9/11, took out pretty much all of the Wall Street area. Over 600 buildings burned to the ground. And that sort of triggered the city to get a much better water supply that we enjoy today. That literally the water that you drink and the water that is put on fires comes all the way ultimately from the Delaware River, basically, that basin. So it comes a long distance all the way into New York City. So it's an interesting thing. How about the firefighters themselves? How about the equipment they use? Well, of course, you see firefighters today wear self-contained breathing apparatuses, those big air bottles on their backs, right? They wear special coats and gloves and helmets and boots and they very well insulated stuff. But back in the earliest of days, really all they had was their gloves, their helmets, and their coats and boots to a certain extent. They didn't have SCBA, they didn't have what we call thermal imaging cameras to see through smoke. They didn't have radios, they didn't have a lot of things, but they did have early equipment. So what I've got here for you is just an interesting little tidbit here. This is an old fire helmet, similar to one that you saw in the book. This one happens to be from Paterson, New Jersey. It was the chief of the Paterson Fire Department from around the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. So notice it's got this big eagle on top here. Notice it's kind of not in the greatest shape, but it's got a gold front. This is called a front piece up here. It's got this long sort of back on it over here, and it looks substantial, but it's an earlier version of a fire helmet. This one, like I said, is probably about 130 years old or so. Let me show you one that's more modern, one that looks very much like it. This one over here happened to be mine from several years ago. Doesn't look that much different. Notice the eagle is now much shorter. It's got this face shield on it. The brim is perhaps a little bit shorter, but basically it's not that much different. So there's a lot of tradition in the fire service. We use a lot of things because they work. Can we improve upon them? Certainly can. But we do in fact preserve a lot of traditions and things we do, particularly not so much in equipment, because we always try to evolve the equipment, keep some of the more interesting aspects of it intact, but we also do change our techniques as time requires, and as of course, fires have somewhat changed in the last 200 years. I mean, there were no plastics 200 years ago, so we deal and no real flammable liquids back then, like gasoline and things like that. So as time has gone on in the fire service, we've adapted to try to deal with the situation at hand and things. So when it comes to progress, we keep the good traditions and we move on and change things as necessary to make improvements. So, for example, after 9/11, we know there were all sorts of issues that day and a variety of things, including, for example, the radio communications. We now have requirements across the country which allow local fire departments to require high-rise buildings, for example, to upgrade their radio system capabilities. So we actually install special signal amplifiers to make the signal stronger, because that's one of the biggest problems we've had in the fire service, is that when you're in a high-rise building or in the subways and things, the radios don't work. Just like your cell phone doesn't work a lot of times. Certain areas you get into a dead zone or what have you. For firefighters, radios have the same issue in certain types of target hazards. We call them high rises or subways or subterranean areas below grade and things like that. So we've adapted to that, and we've made changes so that we in fact aren't encumbered like they were on 9/11, unable to communicate with a lot of the firefighters in the upper floors that day. So again, we evolve over time. We try to make things as safe as possible for the firefighters of today. We know that cancer is still a major issue for us. not just because of 9/11, but just general firefighting and things. We've had several firefighters across the country who've succumbed to cancer because of smoke conditions and things like that. So safety plays a really big role for us today in what we do. And it's evolved, from 200 years ago, from the most basic equipment to where we are here in 2018, where we've got the most advanced equipment. And as time goes on, things will get even better for us another 200 years from now. Who knows what that will look like. But so in any case, chapter 3 deals with the history and how we deal with things. A couple of the notes I should make about that chapter. It talks about the fire losses in this country. I could tell you that over the last 20, 25 years, the number of fatalities in this country has actually gone down substantially. That maybe we think it's because of the introduction of smoke detectors. Make sure, in fact, since you're watching this video, that your smoke detector is working and ready to go. If it's battery operated particularly, make sure you have a carbon monoxide detector in your home as well. But our fire losses, the number of fires is going down statistically nationally, as well as the number of fatalities. So that's a very good thing. Now, at the end of the day, any number of fires is still bad. Any number of fatalities is still bad. So, and injuries and things. So we don't want those to happen. So this is something that just, I guess the analogy is like in the world of dentists, right? So dentists are there to take care of your teeth. Very often you have to have cavities taken care of and things like that. The dentist, he or she doesn't really want you to have cavities. So that's why they practice proper dental hygiene, flossing, brushing, things like that. So we sort of do the same kind of thing in the fire end of things. We try to encourage people not to have fires. And if they have one, making sure that they know how to call 911, get everybody out of the home, out of the building, what to do, what not to do, how to use a fire extinguisher, all those kind of things. So we try to train people the best we can. That's part of that public education effort that I mentioned. So in any case, like I said, the chapter sort of wraps up. I'm just looking at the notes here and everything. Wraps up with the fire problem in this country, as well as the purpose and scope of different kinds of agencies and things. So most fire departments, as I was telling you earlier, deal with a lot of things beyond fires now. We deal with hazardous materials. We do all sorts of different kind of emergencies, and we've evolved over the last couple hundred years to be able to deal with those things. So, we have specialized units in the fire department, particularly in FDNY, has got all sorts of specialized units for collapse rescue. So a building collapses, that's really not a fire per se. It could involve a fire, but normally doesn't. And so we need to be able to get people out of a collapsed building. The release of hazardous materials, a big release of chlorine gas at a swimming pool, for example, a public pool. We deal with issues of structural instability besides building collapse and things like that. For example, facades that fall off the sides of buildings and things. We deal, of course, with downed trees during storms. Of course, one of the more common responses we have is the car accidents, right? People that are caught in a car accident are trapped inside. We carry a special tool called the jaws of life to pry doors open. People are trapped under things, on top of things, between things. It's a myriad of different kinds of different issues that we deal with. So the fire services, even though called the fire department, it's really an all hazards department, because that's essentially what we do. And so chapter 3 sort of gives you a taste of that as well, to explain what the situation is and what fire departments do and stuff. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll be posting another one next week for chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7. So until then, make sure that you, again, take your quiz toward the end of the week. First thing, of course, read the 3 chapters, and then post to your discussion board. So, okay, I'll see you next week.